At exactly 3:12 a.m., on a quiet stretch of Route 47, a billionaire stepped inside a near-empty diner. The waitress working that night thought it would be just another graveyard shift. She was wrong. Within an hour, her entire life would be turned upside down, and the security footage would leave investigators stunned. This isn't a story about money. It's a story about secrets, buried ones, and the woman who accidentally uncovered the wrong one at exactly the wrong moment. Who really walked into that diner, and why was he being hunted? The rain hammered down on the asphalt that night, the kind of storm that makes you question whether you should even be on the road. Inside the Bluebird diner, fluorescent lights flickered against the darkness outside, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Emily Carter had been wiping down the same counter for the third time, her mind already drifting to the pile of bills waiting on her kitchen table and whether her son had remembered to lock the door before going to bed. The clock on the wall ticked past 3 in the morning, each second stretching into eternity during these lonely hours when the world seemed to hold its breath. She'd worked this shift for nearly 7 years, and in all that time, she'd learned to read people the moment they walked through that door. The truckers heading east, the insomniacs seeking coffee and conversation, the occasional drunk stumbling in from the roadside bar 2 miles down. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for what was about to unfold in the next 60 minutes. 3 people would find themselves inside that diner before the night was over. Emily Carter, 42 years old, a woman who'd spent her entire adult life working herself to the bone in a town that had forgotten how to dream. Daniel Hargrove, a name that appeared on Forbes lists and charity galas, a tech billionaire whose face smiled from magazine covers while his business dealings remained carefully hidden behind layers of corporate paperwork and non-disclosure agreements. And then there was the driver of that black pickup truck, a shadow that had been circling this story long before anyone realized there was a story to tell. Why did a man worth $3 billion show up at a run-down diner in rural Ohio at 3 in the morning? What did Emily see that night that made her hands shake so badly she could barely dial 911? And why had the truck driver followed him there, waiting in the parking lot with his headlights cutting through the rain like accusatory fingers? Police say what happened next shouldn't have been possible, that the sequence of events defied logical explanation. But the truth behind that early morning encounter, the real truth that eventually emerged after weeks of investigation and testimony, is stranger than any fiction writer could have imagined. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand Emily Carter, because her story is the story of countless American women who've been handed a raw deal and decided to make something of it anyway. She grew up in Millbrook, Ohio, a town of 8,000 people where everyone knows your business before you do, and the biggest excitement is Friday night high school football. She married her high school sweetheart at 19, had a son by 21, and watched her marriage crumble by 35 when her husband decided the grass was greener with a woman he'd met at a sales conference in Cleveland. The divorce left her with a mortgage she could barely afford, a 14-year-old boy who needed her more than ever, and a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could fix. Emily worked the day shift at the county courthouse, filing paperwork and answering phones for 8 hours before heading home to make dinner, help with homework, and try to be the parent her son deserved. Then, 3 nights a week, she'd drive to the Bluebird diner and work the graveyard shift from midnight to 8 in the morning, serving coffee to strangers and collecting tips that barely covered her car insurance. Her coworkers described her as reliable, the kind of person who never called in sick and always picked up extra shifts when someone needed coverage. She was quiet, observant, the type who noticed when regulars ordered something different or seemed troubled by something they wouldn't talk about. She never caused drama, never gossiped, never asked for special treatment. She just showed up, did her job, and went home. But that quiet observation, that ability to notice the details other people missed, would become the most important skill she'd ever possessed. The people who knew Emily said she had a good heart, maybe too good for a world that seemed determined to take advantage of kindness. Her son, Marcus, was her entire world, a bright kid with dreams of studying engineering at Ohio State if they could somehow figure out how to pay for it. Every tip she earned, every extra shift she worked, went into a college fund that grew at an agonizingly slow pace. She'd lie awake some nights doing the math in her head, calculating how many more years of double shifts it would take to give her son a chance at something better than Millbrook could offer. Backstory: Daniel Hargrove's life 6 to 9. Daniel Hargrove's public image was carefully crafted and meticulously maintained, the kind of reputation that required a full-time team of publicists and lawyers to keep polished. He'd made his fortune in the tech industry, one of those entrepreneurs who seemed to appear out of nowhere in the early 2000s with a revolutionary idea and the ruthless determination to see it through. His company, Hargrove Technologies, specialized in data analytics and artificial intelligence, the kind of complex systems that ordinary people didn't understand, but that corporations paid billions to access. By the time he was 40, Daniel was worth more money than most people could conceptualize, the kind of wealth that existed primarily as numbers in accounts scattered across multiple countries. He lived in a sprawling estate outside Columbus, behind gates and security systems that kept the world at a comfortable distance. His rare public appearances were at charity events, where he'd write checks that made headlines and give speeches about giving back to the community. The local media loved him, this hometown success story who'd put Ohio on the tech industry map. But there were rumors, whispers that circulated in business circles, and occasionally surfaced in investigative journalism pieces that never seemed to gain traction. Former business partners who'd signed away their shares of the company under mysterious circumstances, employees who'd left suddenly and couldn't be reached for comment, a pattern of legal settlements with non-disclosure agreements that prevented anyone from discussing what had really happened behind the closed doors of Hargrove Technologies. 3 years before that night at the diner, a junior executive named Patricia Morrison had filed a wrongful termination lawsuit, claiming she'd been forced out after discovering financial irregularities in the company's books. The case was settled out of court within 2 weeks for an undisclosed sum, and Patricia moved to California and refused to speak to reporters. 6 months after that, a business journalist named Thomas Chen began investigating allegations of corporate espionage and data theft at Hargrove Technologies. His editor killed the story before publication, citing concerns about libel, and Thomas found himself unable to get freelance work anywhere in the industry. Then there was the matter of Rebecca Hollis, a woman who'd worked as Daniel's personal assistant for 3 years before vanishing without explanation. Her friends told police she'd seemed frightened in the weeks before her disappearance, that she'd mentioned having information about something illegal but wouldn't provide details. The investigation went nowhere because there was no evidence of foul play, just a woman who'd apparently decided to start over somewhere else. Rebecca's sister never stopped searching, never stopped insisting that her sister would never have left without saying goodbye. But eventually, even she had to accept that some questions don't get answered. In the weeks leading up to that night, Emily had noticed things at the diner that seemed insignificant at the time, but would later take on a haunting significance. There was the conversation she'd overheard between 2 state troopers who'd stopped in for coffee, talking about a cold case they'd been asked to review involving a missing woman from 3 years ago. There was the black pickup truck that had started appearing in the parking lot around 2 in the morning, always parked in the same spot near the road where the driver could watch the entrance. The truck would sit there for an hour or more, engine running, before pulling away without anyone coming inside. Emily had mentioned it to her manager, but he'd shrugged it off as probably someone waiting to pick up a friend from the bar down the road. Then there was the man she'd seen standing across the street one night, when she'd stepped outside for a breath of air during her break. He'd been partially hidden in the shadows near the closed hardware store, and when Emily looked directly at him, he'd turned and walked away. She'd felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind, that primal instinct that tells you when you're being watched. She'd locked the diner door when she went back inside, something she almost never did during business hours. Her coworker Linda had noticed Emily seemed distracted, jumpy in a way that wasn't like her. Linda asked if everything was okay at home, if her son was having trouble at school, but Emily had brushed off the concern with a tired smile. How could she explain that she felt like something was coming? some unnamed thing that she couldn't quite see but knew was there, waiting. But nothing prepared her for the man who walked in next. The bell above the door chimed at 3:12 a.m., and Emily looked up from the coffee maker, expecting to see one of the regular truckers, who usually stopped in around this time. Instead, she found herself staring at Daniel Hargrove, though she didn't know his name yet, didn't recognize the face that had smiled from so many magazine covers and news segments. All she saw was a man in his mid-40s, soaked to the skin despite the expensive raincoat he wore, his hair plastered to his forehead, and his eyes carrying the kind of fear that made Emily's stomach tighten with instinctive alarm. He wasn't wearing his usual tailored suit, but rather dark jeans and a simple button-down shirt that might have come from any department store. There was no security detail, no assistant hovering nearby with a phone and clipboard, no driver waiting in a luxury car outside. Just a man who looked like he'd been running from something and had finally run out of places to go. He stood in the doorway for a moment, water dripping onto the checkered floor, his eyes scanning the diner like he was cataloging every exit and every corner where someone might be hiding. Emily felt her customer service smile falter, because this wasn't the behavior of someone stopping in for a late-night meal. This was the behavior of someone in trouble. He walked to the counter slowly, his hands visible and trembling slightly, and slid onto a stool in the middle section, where he could see both the front entrance and the door leading to the kitchen. Emily approached with her order pad, going through the familiar motions because routine was the only thing that made sense in this suddenly strange situation. She asked what he wanted, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, like he'd been shouting, or crying, or both. "Just coffee," he said, black, and kept his eyes on the windows where the rain created rivers of distortion across the glass. Emily poured the coffee, noting the way his hands shook when he wrapped them around the cup, the way he kept checking his phone even though he never actually made a call or sent a message. That's when Emily noticed the envelope tucked inside his jacket, a large manila envelope that seemed too bulky to be just papers, that created an unnatural shape against his ribs. He caught her looking and pulled the jacket tighter around himself, a defensive gesture that told Emily everything she needed to know about how valuable whatever was in that envelope must be. The diner was empty except for the two of them, Linda having stepped out back for a cigarette break that was taking longer than usual. The only sounds were the rain hammering against the roof, the occasional thunder that made the lights flicker, and the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Emily tried to make small conversation, the way she always did with customers who seemed troubled, asking if he needed anything else, if he wanted to see a menu. He shook his head without looking at her, his attention fixed on something outside that she couldn't see. Then his whole body went rigid, and Emily followed his gaze to the parking lot where a black pickup truck had just pulled in, the same truck she'd seen circling the area for weeks. The headlights stayed on, high beams cutting through the rain and illuminating the diner's interior like a stage. Emily couldn't see the driver through the glare, but she could see the silhouette of someone sitting behind the wheel, not moving, just watching. The man at the counter, Daniel, though she still didn't know his name, let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He pulled out his wallet and threw a $100 bill on the counter, way too much for a single cup of coffee, and started to stand like he was going to make a run for it. Emily wanted to ask what was happening, wanted to call the police, or her manager, or someone who would know what to do, but her voice seemed to have disappeared, and that's when the diner's door swung open, and the driver of the black pickup truck stepped inside, bringing with him a gust of wind and rain and something else, something that felt like violence waiting to happen. The discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation and the community. Here was Sarah, or what remained of her, in an area that multiple trained search teams had supposedly covered thoroughly. How had they missed her for 4 months? That question alone raised serious concerns about the competency of the initial search efforts, but even more troubling were the questions raised by the condition and position of the remains. The medical examiner's initial assessment struggled to determine a cause of death. The body was significantly decomposed, skeletonized in some areas, which made determining what had happened extremely difficult. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones themselves, no fractures or marks that would indicate violence. but the USB cable around the neck and the position of the body immediately suggested either suicide or staged suicide. The problem was figuring out which. This is where the case split into two competing narratives that would eventually tear the community apart and lead to one of the most controversial trials in recent Ohio history. The first narrative, the one that some investigators initially leaned toward, was that Sarah had taken her own life. She had a documented history of depression. She'd been found in a secluded area of woods where someone seeking privacy and finality might go. The cable around her neck and secured to the tree suggested a method of self-harm. Her rings placed at the base of the tree could be interpreted as a final symbolic gesture, a removal of the ties that bound her to a life she no longer wanted to live. In this version of events, the tragedy was simple and heartbreaking. A woman in crisis making an irreversible decision, and a search effort that failed to find her until it was far too late. But the second narrative, the one that would eventually lead to criminal charges, suggested something far darker. This version questioned almost everything about the scene. How does someone hang themselves in a kneeling position with a USB cable attached to a branch that low? The mechanics seemed wrong to investigators who'd seen actual suicide scenes. Why would someone remove their rings and place them carefully at the base of the tree before dying? That kind of deliberate staging suggested someone else's involvement, someone trying to create a scene that looked like suicide, but getting the details subtly wrong. And then there were the questions about David's behavior in the months after Sarah's disappearance, the way he'd seemed more resigned than desperate, more focused on controlling the narrative than frantically searching for answers. Add to this some troubling timeline inconsistencies in David's account of that last night. Phone records that didn't quite match his version of events, and a few statements he'd made to friends that seemed oddly detached, and a picture began to emerge of a husband who might know more than he was saying. The investigation intensified, now focused specifically on David Moore as a potential suspect. Detectives re-interviewed everyone who knew the couple, looking for any evidence of escalating conflict or violence. They brought in forensic experts to examine the remains and the scene more carefully. They built a timeline of David's movements on the day Sarah disappeared and in the days immediately following. They analyzed his phone, his computer, his financial records, looking for anything that might indicate planning or consciousness of guilt. What they found wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough to convince prosecutors that they could make a case. 6 months after Sarah's remains were discovered, David Moore was arrested and charged with murder. The prosecution's theory was straightforward in concept, but complex in execution. They argued that David had killed Sarah in their home, most likely by strangulation, during or after an argument on the night of May 25th. They suggested that he'd then transported her body to the woods under cover of darkness, staged the scene to look like a suicide, and returned home to begin the performance of being a concerned husband whose wife had inexplicably vanished. Their case rested on several key pillars. First, the forensic evidence, particularly the opinion of their medical examiner, who concluded that the fractures found in Sarah's neck bones were consistent with manual strangulation rather than hanging. Second, the implausibility of the suicide staging, the kneeling position, the low branch, the placed rings, details that they argued no one taking their own life would think to include. Third, David's behavior and statements, the lack of emotional affect, the inconsistencies in his timeline, statements to friends suggesting marital discord he later downplayed. And fourth, the absence of any evidence that Sarah had left the house under her own power that morning. No sightings, no phone activity, no logical explanation for where she would have gone or why. The defense mounted an equally vigorous counter-argument that exposed significant weaknesses in the prosecution's case. They brought in their own forensic expert, who examined the same evidence and reached a completely different conclusion, arguing that the neck fractures were entirely consistent with hanging, and that manual strangulation would have left different, more extensive damage. They pointed out that the prosecution's expert had never actually examined Sarah's body in person, had only reviewed photographs and reports, raising serious questions about the reliability of that testimony. They challenged the assertion that the scene staging was implausible bringing in mental health experts who testified that people in severe depressive episodes can engage in ritualistic behaviors before taking their own lives, that the placement of rings could represent a symbolic severing of earthly attachments. They highlighted Sarah's documented history of depression and suicidal ideation, medical records showing she'd had thoughts of self-harm in the past, even if she'd never acted on them. But perhaps most damaging to the prosecution's case was the defense's systematic dismantling of the investigation itself. They showed how search teams had indeed covered the area where Sarah was found, multiple times, raising the question of whether her body had actually been there all along, or if it had been placed there later. They demonstrated that the crime scene had been contaminated and poorly documented, with crucial photographs missing and evidence handling protocols violated. They presented alternative timelines that were just as consistent with the evidence as the prosecution's version, scenarios in which Sarah could have left the house early that morning and taken her own life without David's knowledge or involvement. They portrayed David not as a calculated killer but as a grieving husband being railroaded by investigators who were embarrassed by their own failures and needed someone to blame. The trial lasted 3 weeks and became a media spectacle, with every day's testimony analyzed and debated on local news and true crime forums. The prosecution presented witness after witness, building their circumstantial case, piece by careful piece. The defense dismantled each element, showing reasonable doubt at every turn. Sarah's family sat in the courtroom every single day, desperate for answers, for justice, for some way to make sense of their loss. Some of them believed David was responsible and needed to be held accountable. Others weren't sure what to believe anymore. The competing narratives had created such confusion that certainty felt impossible. The jury deliberated for 4 days, an agonizing stretch during which everyone connected to the case existed in suspended animation, waiting for a verdict that would define how Sarah's story would be remembered. When the jury returned, the courtroom was silent. The foreperson stood and delivered the verdict that would shock almost everyone who'd followed the case closely. Not guilty. David Moore was acquitted of all charges. The decision hit Sarah's family like a physical blow, some of them openly weeping, others sitting in stunned silence. David himself broke down, tears streaming down his face. Whether from relief or the weight of everything he'd endured or something else entirely, no one could say for certain. The prosecution was blindsided. They'd believed they had enough to secure a conviction, and the acquittal felt like a repudiation of months of careful work. But the jury had spoken, and in the American justice system, their word was final. In the aftermath of the trial, the divisions only deepened. The medical examiner's office refused to change Sarah's death certificate, which still lists her manner of death as homicide, an extraordinary position to maintain after an acquittal. The police department stood by their investigation, with several detectives giving interviews, expressing their continued belief that David was responsible and that the jury had simply gotten it wrong. Sarah's family remained split, some certain of David's guilt, others accepting the verdict as the closest thing to truth they were likely to get. David himself struggled to rebuild any semblance of a normal life, the stigma of having been accused of murdering his wife clinging to him even after his acquittal. He eventually wrote a book about his experience, maintaining his innocence and describing the nightmare of being wrongly accused, but the book only reignited debates rather than settling them. The case continues to haunt everyone it touched because there are no satisfying answers, only competing interpretations of ambiguous evidence. If David killed Sarah, he got away with it, a thought that torments her family and the investigators who worked so hard to prove his guilt. If David is innocent, then Sarah died alone in those woods, consumed by a depression that ultimately proved fatal, and her husband was then put through a hellish ordeal of suspicion and prosecution for a crime that never occurred. Both possibilities are awful in different ways, and the evidence genuinely supports both narratives, depending on how you weigh each piece and what assumptions you bring to your interpretation. This is the reality of many criminal cases. They're not like television shows where everything resolves neatly in the final act. They're messy, complicated, filtered through imperfect investigations and fallible witnesses and forensic science that's more uncertain than most people realize. What we're left with are questions that may never be fully answered. Was justice truly served? Did the jury reach the right conclusion based on reasonable doubt, or did a guilty man walk free because the prosecution couldn't quite prove what they knew in their hearts to be true? And what about Sarah herself? Does she get lost in all these debates about guilt and innocence, reduced to evidence in competing theories, rather than remembered as a full human being who lived and loved and suffered? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They matter profoundly to everyone who knew Sarah, to her family who will never get her back regardless of how she died, to a community that's been forced to confront how little certainty is actually possible, even when you want it desperately. The truth, whatever it is, remains somewhere in that gap between what we can prove and what we can know, between the story the evidence tells and the story we need it to tell, to make sense of senseless loss. I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think really happened that night? And if you want more real-life mysteries that challenge everything you think you know, make sure you're subscribed, because the next case is even stranger.